Now, the Torah or the Chumash, the first 5 books of Moses, are secondary sources. Now, if we found a copy of the Torah that was 3,500 years old, that would still be called a secondary source. And the reason is that the Torah is writing about events that happened hundreds of years earlier. On the other hand, the works of the Nevi'im or Navi, they are being written by prophets who claim to have witnessed these events. But we only have much more recent copies of the works of the prophets. Therefore, they must be called secondary sources. On the other hand, if we found an original copy of one of the works of the prophets, like Hosea or Amos, then one could say that that is a primary source. However, if one wants to be more nuanced about it, even that, one could argue, is a secondary source, because primary sources are only about that which you observe. It is not explanations, and the works of the prophets are not only about what they observe, it's also explanation of the events and theology or God, which is something that one can never really observe. Because again, primary sources are only that which you observe. Secondary sources, even if they are written at the time of the event by witnesses, once they are explaining the events, not only talking about what they observe, it is now a secondary source. So sources that are written can be partly primary and partly secondary. So when it's written at the time of the event, you can have a portion in which the person is just talking about what they observed, and then another portion where they start explaining it, and that part is secondary. So one can have sources that are partly primary sources and partly a secondary source. Next, I would like to talk about ancient Yerushalayim, which was called originally Metzudat Zion under Jebusite rule. In the story in Shmuel Bet, we learn about how the Jebusites posted to guard their walls the blind and the handicapped. And the reason why is they wanted to mock the Hebrew army because they were so confident in their defenses, because the city is on a mountaintop, it's surrounded by a canyon, and then there's even mountains on the outside. And plus, it had a very strong wall. And in the story in Shmuel Bet, King David and his generals find a weakness in the defenses of the city. They find what is called the Tzinor. This is a great example of the idea of an absence of evidence is not evidence. What this means is that when you don't find evidence for a particular event, it just means that we don't know whether it happened or not. Because maybe sometime in the future, you may find evidence that indicates that this event actually happened. So when we find no evidence that a certain event happened, then the prudent approach is to say, until we find evidence that either indicates the event did not happen or evidence that indicates that it did happen, then we have to leave it as a question. Again, the weakness which King David's men found in Metzudat Zion, is a natural cave which they called the Tzinor. Now here we are able to see it. This is the Tzinor. Now the Tzinor is what is called a karst. A karst is where a cave forms naturally through water erosion. What happens is that you have one layer on the top, which is harder, and another layer right below it, which is soft, and then another harder layer. And the water washes away the mud or dirt in the middle, and that forms a cave. So they attacked through the cave, and then they overwhelmed the defenses of the Jebusites. Now, a number of historians and archaeologists said this story is a fanciful story and it could never have occurred. And the reason why they said that is that we don't see a cave under the area which was the Jebusite part of the city. And this is a great example of the idea. So a number of historians were comparing this story to the story of Troy and the Trojan horse. Again, in that example, we have no evidence that there was ever a Trojan horse, and we have no evidence that the city of Troy ever existed. However, in the late 1800s, the English explorer and archaeologist Sir Charles Warren found the Tzinor, and therefore he named it after himself, and that's why it is now called Warren's Shaft. Now, we'll actually walk in both Warren's Shaft and also Hezekiah's tunnel. So now, Warren's Shaft, or the Tzinor, after the Jews took over the area, they expanded it in order to make it easier to walk in it. Now, the reason why they expanded it is that the strategic weakness in this city is that there is no water source within these city walls. So therefore, when the city was under siege, it could easily run underwater. So they expanded the cave so it went from within the city walls and all the way to the Gihon spring, which was the closest water source. And again, they expanded it and made it wider to make it easier for people to walk in it. Now, hundreds of years later, when the city was under the rule of King Chizkiyahu, in English his name is Hezekiah, he knew that the Assyrians were going to attack. Therefore, he wanted to fortify the defenses of the city. And one of the ways that he wanted to fortify it is, he said that the Tzinor was not adequate in providing water for the city, because a person would have to crawl in this narrow cave and physically bring buckets of water to the city. And by this time, there were too many people living in the city for the Tzinor to provide enough water for this city under siege. Therefore, he made an aqueduct that ran from the Gihon spring to an underground well within the city walls. Now, another reason why he felt a need to make a tunnel and an aqueduct is that the Tzinor wasn't very far underground, so an enemy could easily find it and also block it. However, Hezekiah's tunnel was made much deeper, so it would be harder for an enemy army to find it and to attack it. And another major advantage of Hezekiah's tunnel was, again, that it was an aqueduct. So rather than a person having to walk in it in order to bring the water flowed on its own. An aqueduct is where you make a pipe or a tunnel where water moves over a large area at a very slight angle. Most aqueducts are above ground. However, Hezekiah's tunnel was made above ground. Now, one may wonder, how were they able to, using ancient technology, to build this very accurate aqueduct so deep underground for over 533 meters? And we actually know the real answer because they found on the walls of Hezekiah's tunnel an inscription in which either a worker or someone who is an engineer working on Hezekiah's tunnel wrote in Hebrew how they accomplished this great feat. Now, they explain how they did it. So they had one team start at the Gihon spring, and they had one team on the top, meaning above ground, and then they also took another team that worked below ground. And so the idea was that first the team below ground dug for a little bit, and then he waited to hear the signal from the team above ground which direction to move. So the team above ground would move forward a little bit, and they would bang on the rocks and the dirt above ground, and in that way the people digging below ground knew where to move. Now, so they had these two teams that started at the Gihon spring. Then they also had the same system going on, starting at the well within the city walls. One team working on the top and one team working on the bottom below ground. So both teams, both groups of teams, the two groups that started at the Gihon spring move forward, and then the teams who were starting at the well also slowly move forward in this way, and then they met in the middle. And that's how they built Hezekiah's tunnel. Now you may have noticed on this inscription, in which I'm saying that it is written in Hebrew. I know it's pretty hard to see it, but also other artifacts that we have seen in which I have claimed that it has been written in Hebrew. It doesn't appear like our Hebrew. And so here's another example where it'll be more obvious, where you can see the Hebrew a little bit more easily. That is ancient Hebrew there. Now, and here's ancient Hebrew, and these simply do not seem to look like our Hebrew. And I will explain now why. We now write Hebrew with the Assyrian alphabet. What we call Hebrew is actually Hebrew that is written with the Assyrian alphabet. Ancient Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew alphabet looks like this. Now, the reason why we use the Assyrian alphabet is that during our first exile, in which we were exiled into Assyria, most Jews could no longer read Hebrew, but they could read Assyrian. Therefore, in order to save the Hebrew language and knowledge of the Torah in the original language, the Jews started writing they started writing Hebrew using the Assyrian alphabet. It's exactly like now that you'll sometimes see someone will write a Siddur and transliterate the prayers with the English alphabet. Now, you'll also see how the even earlier forms from which Hebrew evolved look more like pictures and images of animals and other things. Like here, you see the bull. Now, how all language evolves is first you have art. Then this art becomes standardized. And then a certain image will start to represent an idea. And then eventually it represents just a word. And that kind of symbol is not called a letter or an alphabet. Only once the symbol only makes a sound and it doesn't represent or seem to indicate any sort of image or thing that exists, is it called an alphabet, and each symbol is called a letter. Again, letters are just symbols that represent particular sounds. All right. Now, another major issue that historians had with saying that the Israelites under King David had taken over Metzudat Zion was not only that they had not found a cave that was used to take over the city, that again made this story sound fanciful. The other biggest issue was there was no evidence of ancient Hebrew settlement of Metzudat Zion. All evidence was much later. But soon after the finding of the Tzinor, or Warren Shaft, they found a number of other pieces of evidence that seemed to indicate that the Hebrews did in fact take it over at the time of King David. So one piece of evidence was they found the palaces of King David, Solomon, and the later Hebrew kings that dates from this time period. Now, the Ophel, let me find another image. The Ophel is this area that was just north of the walls, right there. And now on this other map, we'll see the Ophel would be about here. They figured out, and they believe that it was in fact made and used by the Hebrew kings based on the seals, the royal seals that were found in and around the Ophel. Now, another piece of evidence was that in Shmuel Bet, it talks about Solomon making Hamilo, the rampart. So these are the remnants of the rampart, and again, based on what was also found in the area, shards of pots, and the writing is all in Hebrew, that seems to indicate that it was made by the Hebrews and used by the Hebrews dating from that time period. And how the Milo may have looked originally, you see it right here. This is how we think the Milo originally looked. And the Milo, again, was used both for defense and possibly also for holding important meetings. All right. I want to make it clear that I'm not now arguing that we know 100% that the events mentioned in Shmuel Bet about the takeover of Metzudat Zion from the Jebusites by King David happen exactly as it indicates in Shmuel Bet. But, however, I think we can make a case that it is plausible, that there's no evidence that seems to indicate that it could not have happened in that way. But we have a very strong case to argue that there was an Israelite takeover of Metzudat Zion at the time of King David. I have not presented all of the evidence, but there's a lot of evidence that the Hebrews have taken over Yerushalayim from the Jebusites. Now, I just want to talk again briefly how historians and archaeologists view and use the Torah. How they use it is, again, they see it as a secondary source, so they won't use it as evidence for any one event happening. But how they use it is that if they want an idea of where to dig, they will often use the Torah as a source to influence where they are going to start a dig. And another way in which they use the Torah, they will often use it in order to help them better understand primary evidence, because these ancient writers have more insight into the age that they are writing about than anyone who is alive now. All right, I hope you found this insightful.